Usually when we talk about getting a medical diagnosis, there is this expectation of uh, absolute precision.
Right.
I mean, think of it like engineering. You break your arm, you go into the clinic, and they take an X-ray.
Yeah.
And that X-ray shows that jagged white line on the black film, and the doctor just points at it and says, there it is. That is the problem.
It is binary. I mean, you look at the film and the diagnosis is objective, broken or not broken.
Yes, a clean reality.
Yeah.
But then you step into the world of human suffering or historical tragedy or, even just our own daily struggles. And suddenly that X-ray machine seems completely broken.
Oh, for sure.
We are looking at a diagnostic landscape of life that is incredibly murky. We want to know why things happen, when they will be fixed, and if anyone is actually paying attention to the chaos at all.
The human experience is pretty much the definition of diagnostic muddy waters. We want clear answers for our pain, but we usually just get more questions.
Well, welcome to Reform Thinking. I am thrilled you are joining us for another deep dive today. And today we are taking a radically different path to answer those questions.
We really are.
We are looking at a single patch of burning dirt in the Sinai Desert. We are going to look at just 3 sentences spoken from that fire. 3 sentences that completely dismantle our modern ideas of justice, of timing, and how the creator of the universe reacts to human suffering.
It is a massive text.
Our mission today is to unpack a comprehensive, systematic biblical exegesis of Exodus chapter 3, verses 7 through 9. We are looking at how an infinite, holy God relates to the temporal afflictions of his people.
Right.
And we're going to do this by stripping away all our modern sentimentalism. We want to look straight at the objective syntax and the rigorous theology of the text.
And we have a huge stack of source material for this analysis.
Right.
We are drawing from 2 highly detailed exegetical commentaries written from a confessional Reformed perspective.
Which gives us a really solid base.
Yeah, these documents give us a meticulous grammatical and historical breakdown of the burning bush narrative. What stands out immediately is that these authors are not interested in soft therapeutic readings.
No, not at all.
They look at the raw Hebrew verbs, the historical setting, and the sheer theological weight of the event.
And I want to frame this for you, the listener, right from the start. This is not some dry academic exercise where we just parse verbs in a vacuum.
Definitely not.
I want you to imagine standing in the desolate wilderness. The sun is beating down on the dirt. You are looking at a bush that is engulfed in flames, yet the wood is not turning to ash.
It is a wild scene.
And from that unconsumed fire, the self-existent God speaks. It is a thrilling, terrifying reality. We're going to break down the actual words spoken from that fire. But before we get to the words, we have to look at the world those words were spoken into.
That is a crucial starting point, because before analyzing the specific dialogue, we have to establish the context of the oppression. The sources are very strict about this.
Right.
They reject modern liberal theological attempts to view the Exodus as some sort of mythological folklore or, a purely symbolic story of liberation. The authors insist on a concrete, verifiable historical timeline.
Okay, let's unpack this timeline then. When are we talking about? Give us the historical coordinates.
The events we are analyzing are situated around 1446 BC. In archaeological and biblical studies, this is often referred to as the early date of the Exodus.
So paint a picture of the world in 1446 BC. What is the geopolitical backdrop? Because, we are not talking about a small, isolated tribe being bullied by a neighboring village.
Not at all. We are looking at the highly advanced 18th dynasty of Egypt's New Kingdom era. This was arguably the pinnacle of ancient Egyptian dominance.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you have figures like Thutmose III, who military historians sometimes call the Napoleon of Egypt, and then his son Amenhotep II ruling the empire. The Egyptian state was a massive, highly organized superpower.
And the Israelites are trapped right in the machinery of this superpower. But the sources point out something fascinating about this slavery. It was not just a matter of economic exploitation, right?
Right.
They weren't just keeping the Hebrews around because they needed cheap labor for building projects.
The commentaries make a very sharp distinction here. The enslavement was an intentional state-sponsored genocide. You have to remember the mandate God gave to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
To be fruitful and multiply.
Precisely. Be fruitful, multiply, and bless the nations. The Egyptian state recognized this biological and cultural multiplication as a direct threat.
Yeah, they saw the numbers growing.
So the forced labor, the throwing of the male infants into the Nile, this was a systematic attempt to crush the Abrahamic seed. It was a completely anti-covenantal policy.
That raises the stakes incredibly high. It is not just a labor dispute. is a cosmic battle over a promised bloodline. And the geography plays a huge role in this drama, too. We have this stark contrast happening simultaneously. Talk about the locations involved.
Well, you have the fertile, idol-worshipping Nile Delta. The delta is lush, it is green, and it is the center of Egyptian agricultural and religious life.
And that is where Israel is.
Yeah, that is where Israel is laboring in the mud, making bricks under the whip. But then you have the rugged, isolated wilderness of Mount Horeb. It is a place of total desolation, dry rocks, scrub brush, and silence.
Let's visualize that contrast for a second. Think about the massive, intimidating architectural monuments of Egypt's empire. You have these colossal statues, towering pyramids, sprawling temples with massive columns.
Huge structures.
Right, all projecting absolute dominance, polytheistic worship, and human glory. And then compare that to the quiet, barren dirt of Sinai. Here's my question. Why does the creator of the universe choose a desolate patch of desert to speak?
It is a great question.
I mean, why not just appear in Pharaoh's throne room, split the ceiling open, and show immediate dominance right then and there?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the geography is intensely tied to the theology. Horeb represents a complete separation from Egyptian polytheism.
Okay, I see.
The commentaries explain that true deliverance requires bringing the people out of an idolatrous culture and into an isolated place where they can learn to worship rightly. God is not just planning a geographic extraction. He is planning a spiritual extraction.
So the wilderness acts like a reset button.
Yes, spot on. The wilderness strips away the noise of the Egyptian gods. Furthermore, there is a temporal aspect to this that the sources highlight.
What do you mean?
This 400-year affliction in Egypt was a precise, decreed timeline foretold to Abraham centuries earlier in Genesis chapter 15. God told Abraham his descendants would be enslaved in a foreign land for 400 years, and then they would come out with great possessions.
That blows my mind. The Israelites are sweating in the mud, feeling like the cosmos has entirely abandoned them, but they're actually sitting right in the middle of a preordained historical schedule.
Yeah, they really are.
The 400 years had to finish. The history of nations is fully subordinate to divine decrees. It was not a random accident of geopolitics that they ended up in Egypt.
The affliction was decreed, and the limit of that affliction was also decreed. The stopwatch started in Genesis 15, and in Exodus 3, the alarm is ringing.
So, having set that physical and historical stage, let's look at the actual words. We are at the burning bush. God starts talking. But he doesn't start by giving Moses a tactical military plan.
No, not at all.
He doesn't give him a to-do list for forming a rebellion. He begins with declarations about his own awareness.
The text breaks this divine awareness down into three distinct categories: sight, sound, and knowledge. The authors of the commentaries spend a massive amount of time on the syntax of these verbs.
Let's dig into that.
Let's look at the element of sight first. God says, he has seen their affliction. The Hebrew construction used here is rawa'edi. Translated literally, that is, surely seen, or seeing I have seen.
Pause there. What does that actually mean grammatically? The sources use a very specific technical term here, a qual infinitive absolute paired with a finite verb.
Yeah, that sounds complicated.
For the listener who hasn't been to seminary and doesn't read ancient Hebrew, explain how that functions in regular speech.
Let's break it down simply. In English, if we want to add certainty to an action, we use adverbs. We say, I definitely saw that, or I certainly heard that.
Right.
Biblical Hebrew often achieves this certainty by doubling the verb. The infinitive absolute is placed right next to the regular finite verb of the same root. So instead of just saying, I saw, the text says, seeing, I have seen.
Okay, that makes sense.
This specific grammatical structure stresses absolute certainty and continuous, unbroken observation.
It is not a casual glance from heaven. It is a locked-in, unblinking stare.
Precisely. The commentaries argue that this Hebrew syntax directly refutes the deistic idea of a detached first cause.
Remind us what deism is.
Deism pictures a god who winds up the universe like a giant clock, sets it on a table, and walks away to let it run on its own. Exodus 3 destroys that concept. Yahweh is actively, intensely tracking the specific affliction of the Hebrew slaves.
Okay, so that is the sight. Then we move to the sound. God says he hears their agonizing cry.
The Hebrew word for the cry is sa'akor. The sources note that this is not a formal structured prayer. It is not a hymn sung in a sanctuary.
It's much more raw than that.
Yes, this is a visceral, shrieking, desperate cry wrung out of human bodies by physical pain. And the text specifically identifies who is causing the pain. They're taskmasters, referred to as norshaw God is listening to the specific sound of the whip hitting the back.
Sight, sound, and then we get to the third category. Knowledge. God declares, I know. The Hebrew word is yadati.
This is a crucial term for understanding the entire passage. Yada, in classical Hebrew, indicates a relational, covenantal knowledge. It's not just acquiring intellectual data.
Right, it's not trivial trivia.
Yeah, it is not like reading a spreadsheet and saying, ah, yes, I know the population statistics of Egypt.
Give us an example of how yada is used elsewhere to help us grasp the weight of it.
The commentaries point out two great examples. First, it is the same root word used in Genesis 4.1 to describe the physical marital union between Adam and Eve. Adam knew Eve, his wife.
That is a very intimate knowledge.
And second, it is used in Amos 3.2, where God says to national Israel, "You only have I known of all the families of the earth." God was intellectually aware of the Babylonians and the Assyrians, but he only knew Israel. It implies an intimate, chosen, protective knowledge.
So what does this all mean for the big theological debates? You mentioned earlier that the commentaries are heavily focused on systematic theology. The sources argue the syntax, the unblinking stare, the hearing of the shriek, the covenantal knowledge entirely refute some major theological frameworks.
They do, yes.
Specifically open theism, process theology, and Armenian conditionalism.
Yes, the authors are very aggressive in applying the grammar to these frameworks.
Wait, pause there. You just threw out open theism, process theology, and Armenian conditionalism. Let's define our terms so we don't lose anyone. What do those Selenisms actually claim?
Let's take them one by one. Open theism argues that God does not possess exhaustive, definitive knowledge of the future because the future does not exist yet. It claims he learns as human history unfolds.
Okay, so he's acquiring new data.
Right. Then process theology takes it further, arguing that God is actually changing and evolving alongside the universe.
Wow.
And then Arminian conditionalism, in the context of salvation, argues that God's redemptive plan is conditioned upon foreseen human choices. He looks down the corridor of time, sees who will choose him, and reacts accordingly.
So all three of those systems basically put God in a reactionary posture. He is watching the movie of human history play out, and he is reacting to the plot twist just like we are.
That is correct. And the commentaries argue that Exodus 3 absolutely annihilates that reactionary posture. The syntax shows that God's knowledge is not acquired by watching events unfold.
Because he already knows it.
His knowledge is the active, initiating source of his redemptive plan. He is not reacting to Pharaoh. Pharaoh is unwittingly operating within the timeline God decreed to Abraham.
I have to be honest, though. Let me push back on this for a second. If I am listening to this, a huge red flag just went up in my mind.
Sure.
Hearing that God have absolute sovereign timing and an unblinking stare sounds incredibly hollow, maybe even cruel, if I am the Israelite who has been beaten with a whip for my entire life.
That is completely understandable.
If God's sight is so intense and his knowledge is so perfect, why wait generations? If I see someone I love being crushed, I jump in immediately. I don't wait 400 years. How do the sources justify this wait without making God sound indifferent?
That is the most natural human objection, and the commentaries address it head-on. The authors argue that we make a severe categorical error when we confuse human passive sympathy with divine redemptive awareness.
Walk me through the difference between the two.
Well, human sympathy often demands immediate panic action because we lack control over the future. We react quickly because we are afraid of what will happen next.
Because we don't know the outcome?
Right. If you see a child running toward traffic, you dive to grab them immediately because you cannot control the cars. You are operating from a deficit of power. God does not have that fear. God does not operate from a deficit of power.
Let me use an analogy here to see if I am tracking. It feels like watching a highly skilled surgeon who sees a patient suffering in agony, but the surgeon just stands there, watching the monitor, waiting for the precise biological moment to start the operation.
That is a really good picture.
An observer might yell, "Do something," but the surgeon knows that acting prematurely before the anesthesia is fully effective or before the blood pressure stabilizes would ruin the outcome.
That analogy holds up exceptionally well against the source material. The text teaches that God's absolute control does not cancel his care. Rather, his care operates strictly through his absolute sovereign timing.
Okay, I see.
He waits for the exact historical moment when the deliverance will bring maximum glory to his name, judge the Egyptian pantheon most thoroughly, and fulfill the covenant promise to the specific generation decreed.
He sees the whole board. We only see the single square we are standing on. Our panic comes from our limited vision.
Spot on. The delay is not a lack of compassion. It is the execution of a perfect, unalterable plan.
That reframes the entire concept of waiting. Okay, so that covers his divine awareness. We have spent a lot of time on what God perceives. Now the narrative shifts to what God actually does,
The action part.
because this infinite awareness leads to unilateral historical intervention.
Yeah.
God doesn't just watch the surgical monitor. He picks up the scalpel.
We move to verse 8, which features a striking singular phrase, word, and I have come down.
That gives me chills. I have come down.
It is a staggering anthropomorphism. The transcendent God who fills the heavens and the earth, who is not bound by space or time, condescends into the finite, dusty theater of human history.
Just steps right into it.
The texts note that this descent has a twofold goal. It is both a negative extraction and a positive placement. First, to literally snatch away the Israelites from the crushing grip of Egypt. Second, to bring them up to a good and spacious land flowing with milk and honey.
And the theological analysis the authors pull from this single word is massive. The commentaries assert this verse proves that biblical redemption is entirely monergistic. Now we need another definition here. Contrast monergistic with synergistic for us.
Synergism means working together. A synergistic rescue would mean two parties cooperating to achieve the result.
Okay, both chipping in.
Right. Monergism means the work of one. A monergistic rescue is a unilateral act performed by a single party. The commentaries argue that Israel's deliverance is purely monergistic. It is a unilateral act of God alone.
So the Israelites contributed absolutely nothing to their own rescue.
Nothing. They were entirely helpless. The text shows us they did not lobby politically in Pharaoh's court to negotiate better labor laws. They didn't stage a successful military coup.
No uprisings.
Furthermore, and this is critical, they didn't perform a certain number of spiritual exercises to earn a rescue package. They were largely steeped in Egyptian idolatry themselves.
The sources explicitly state that this text refutes systems of cooperative grace. They specifically name Roman Catholicism, where human merit and cooperation are necessary alongside divine grace. The commentaries argue that in the Exodus narrative, human merit is completely absent.
The authors also argue this text entirely dismantles the modern prosperity gospel.
How so? What is the mechanism of that argument?
The prosperity gospel teaches that human action is a trigger for divine blessing. It argues that your faith, your positive confessions, or your financial seed sowing act as levers that force God to move.
Like a vending machine.
Exactly. You do your part, and God is obligated to respond with health or wealth. But in Exodus 3, the Israelites trigger nothing. They're just groaning under a whip. Deliverance belongs entirely to the Lord's unilateral descent. He moves because of his covenant with Abraham, not because the Israelites unlocked a spiritual law.
Let me throw another analogy at you. I think of it this way. A synergistic rescue, a cooperative grace model, is like a struggling swimmer being thrown a life preserver.
Okay, I am with you.
The Coast Guard throws the ring, but the swimmer still has to kick, grab the ring, and hold on tight. If they don't hold on, they drown. God does his part, man does his.
Right, that is synergism.
But the monergistic rescue we see in Exodus 3 is completely different. It is not a struggling swimmer. It is an unconscious diver lying motionless on the bottom of the ocean floor. God dives all the way down, picks up the unconscious body, and carries the diver all the way to the surface. The diver contributes zero effort.
That is a very stark contrast.
How does understanding this total helplessness alter the way a person views grace?
It alters everything because acknowledging total helplessness entirely strips away human pride. If you are the swimmer who grabbed the ring, you can always brag a little bit about your strong grip.
You can take some credit.
Yeah, you say, the Coast Guard threw the ring, but I held on. You share the glory. But if you are the unconscious diver, you can boast in nothing. Deliverance is entirely a gift.
That makes total sense. It humbles you completely.
And this is precisely why the destination, the land of milk and honey, is framed as an inheritance. You don't earn an inheritance. You receive it based on a prior relationship or promise.
You just have to be in the family?
Right. The land was promised to Abraham. It is not a reward handed out to the Israelites for achieving high moral performance in the brickyards.
That shifts the entire paradigm. You are not earning the land. You are inheriting the land. The pressure is off the performance. Let's keep tracing the narrative flow. God does not only rescue the victim, he definitively addresses the oppressor.
We have to talk about the Egyptians.
Yes, the indictment.
The conversation in our sources moves heavily into the indictment of the oppressors, and then it applies this ancient indictment to modern cultural and political frameworks. Looking at verse 9, God says, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. The text introduces the Hebrew word la, means oppression, and it is used in the syntax here as both a noun and an active participle.
Break down the root meaning of law.
The root meaning is physical. To squeeze, to crush, or to thrust hard against something. The Holy Spirit is using specific grammar to show that God is actively tracking the relentless methods of Egyptian cruelty. They are literally squeezing the life out of the Hebrew slaves.
The sources make a crucial point here regarding justice. They argue that true justice requires divine intervention because human courts are always flawed. Only God logs every single strike of the taskmaster's whip. The accounting is flawless.
That is a terrifying thought for the oppressor.
It is. Now, I want to clearly state to you, the listener, before we go any further, the sources apply this ancient text to contemporary political debates. My job and the expert's job right now is simply to report these arguments objectively.
We are just laying out what the text says.
We are conveying the original author's views, as they are laid out in the commentaries, showing how they connect the Exodus to today. We are not endorsing any political side here.
Understood. Let's look at how the commentaries apply the concept of oppression. The authors argue that Exodus 3 stands as a direct refutation of critical race theory and secular social justice movements.
Let's trace the logic here. The authors claim this text refutes secular social justice. Why? What specific part of Exodus 3 are they pointing to in order to make that massive leap? Walk me through their exact argument.
The authors argue that neo-Marxist frameworks view history purely through intersectional power dynamics. They divide humanity into rigid, permanent classes of oppressors and victims based on external characteristics like race or class.
Okay.
According to the commentaries, these movements offer a false gospel of perpetual division, where the oppressor class can never truly be forgiven, and the victim class is forever defined by their trauma.
And how does Exodus 3 counter that, according to the sources?
The texts argue that the root issue in Egypt was not just a material class struggle between the rich Egyptians and the poor Hebrews. It was a theological rebellion.
Oh, because they were attacking God's people.
Yes, the Egyptians were assaulting God's covenant promises. True oppression, the authors state, is defined by a violation of God's objective moral law, not by subjective power dynamics. Therefore, the solution to oppression is not a Marxist redistribution of power or societal revenge, but the perfect justice and redemption provided by God.
So they're arguing that secular frameworks diagnose the disease wrong and prescribe the wrong medicine. The sources also issue a severe rebuke against the modern evangelical church.
They do go after the church as well.
They take aim at the drift toward mysticism and seeker-sensitive pragmatism. Explain the author's reasoning there.
The authors argue that in Exodus 3, God's revelation of himself is rooted in objective historical reality. He is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He acts in real time and space.
It is grounded in facts.
The rebuke is against churches that rely on manufacturing subjective emotional experiences, or churches that use corporate marketing strategies to attract crowds. The commentaries argue that believers must rely entirely on the objective reality of God's perfect oversight and his written word, rather than chasing a mystical high or treating the church like a business venture.
So, considering all this heavy theological and political application, I have to ask the practical question.
Sure.
What does this all mean for someone listening right now who's feeling completely crushed by their circumstances? Maybe it is a medical issue, a financial ruin, or actual systemic injustice. How does the promise of inescapable divine justice change a person's daily outlook on a Tuesday morning?
The sources note that this theological reality provides a vital anchor for the human soul. When you know that God's accounting is perfect, that he logs every tear and every strike of the whip, it completely removes the pressure on you to enact personal vengeance.
You don't have to carry the ledger.
Spot on. It frees a person from relying on secular social engineering to balance the scales of the universe. It places total confidence in the fact that the judge of all the earth will execute perfect justice in his decreed time. You can sleep at night knowing the ledger will be balanced by God, not by your own frantic efforts.
That is a massive relief for anyone carrying the exhausting weight of injustice. You do not have to be the ultimate judge. Your job is to trust the judge.
Exactly.
Okay, let's transition to the final major theme of our sources. We have looked at the historical reality, the grammar, the monergistic rescue, and the indictment. Now we look forward. How does the historical Exodus act as a prophetic pattern for a much greater rescue mission?
The commentaries are adamant that the Old Testament cannot be read in isolation. It is not just a history book. The historical events are typological.
Define typological for us.
Typology is the study of how historical persons, events, or institutions in the Old Testament are designed by God to act as prophetic foreshadowing of the ultimate reality found in the New Testament, specifically in Jesus Christ.
Give us an example from the text we are studying today.
The commentaries point directly to that massive word we discussed earlier, wergerd. I have come down.
Right, the descent.
The authors argue that the literal descent of God in Exodus 3 finds its supreme, ultimate historical realization in the incarnation of Jesus Christ.
The final massive wergerd.
Yes. The sources reference Paul's letter to the Galatians, chapter 4, verses 4 and 5. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law.
Which is incredible.
And they also reference John 1:14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. When the second person of the Trinity took on human nature, God literally, physically came down into the finite human theater.
And the sources heavily compare Moses to Christ, right? But they do it by showing where Moses falls short.
Precisely. Moses is presented as a brilliant but entirely imperfect type of Christ. Moses was a mediator. He stood between God and the people. He delivered a physical nation from physical bondage through temporal, earthly means.
Right, physical borders.
But Christ is the perfect, final mediator. Christ delivers his elect not from a human Pharaoh, but from the spiritual tyranny of sin, the curse of the broken law, and the active wrath of God.
And the elements of the entire Exodus story perfectly line up with this. Think about the Passover later in the narrative. The Passover lamb's blood painted on the doorposts in Egypt clearly foreshadows the cross.
It is a direct parallel.
The commentaries make a vital point here. God's compassion for the slaves does not mean she ignores his own justice. Sin requires payment. Substitution is required. Someone or something has to take the hit so the judgment passes over.
The blood on the doorpost was the only thing shielding the Israelites from the exact same judgment that fell on the Egyptians. It wasn't their ethnicity that saved them, it was the blood of the substitute. This points directly to the substitutionary atonement of Christ.
The sources also insist on maintaining what they call a dispensational distinction when reading this typologically. Break that down for us. What does that mean for how we read the Bible today?
This is a critical interpretive rule for the authors. While they rejoice in the spiritual typology, seeing Christ in the Exodus, they warn against erasing the original meaning of the text.
Okay, so keeping the history intact.
Maintaining a dispensational distinction means acknowledging the spiritual redemption of the multi-ethnic New Testament church, while strictly maintaining that the physical, geographical promises made to national Israel remain literally intact.
So you can't just say the church replaces Israel and the land of Canaan just means heaven.
Correct. The spiritual reality realized in the church does not liquidate the historical terrestrial promises God made to Abraham's physical seed regarding the actual land of the Middle East.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. I want to try to visualize this typology. Think of the historical Exodus as a high-quality architectural blueprint. A blueprint is a real, tangible document. You can hold it in your hands. You can see the blue ink, the exact measurements, the lines. It is historically real. But the entire purpose of a blueprint is to point toward the construction of a massive, three-dimensional skyscraper. The skyscraper is the finished work of Christ.
That is a brilliant way to frame it.
Now, here's my question based on the commentary's warnings. If you just stare at the blueprint and never look up to see the building being constructed, you miss the entire point of the drawing. Why do the sources say that missing this Christological link, failing to look up from the blueprint to the skyscraper, causes a total failure in Christian exegesis?
The argument is devastatingly clear. If you read the Old Testament simply as a collection of inspiring historical rescue missions, you reduce the Bible to a moralistic self-help manual.
You turn it into Aesop's fables.
Exactly. You turn Moses into a generic life coach. You read the story and say, well, Moses stood up to Pharaoh, so I need to stand up to my boss. That entirely misses the theological weight of the text.
It makes it so small.
The Bible demands that all deliverance narratives point directly to the divine mediator. Christ is the one who permanently solves the core human problem. And the core human problem is not bad political leadership. It is spiritual death and alienation from a holy God.
Right.
Moses could only get the Israelites out of the geographic borders of Egypt. He couldn't change their sinful hearts. They ended up worshiping a golden calf a few weeks later.
Moses got the people out of Egypt, But he couldn't get the Egypt out of the people.
Well said.
Only the new covenant, inaugurated by the ultimate wasset of Christ, can do that by replacing the heart of stone with a heart of flesh.
Precisely. The Exodus is the physical picture of the spiritual reality.
We have covered a vast, vast amount of ground today. We started in the mud of the Nile Delta, looked at the exact syllables God spoke from the fire, tackled major theological debates about free will and divine sovereignty, and traced the story all the way to the incarnation. Let's try to summarize the main takeaways from our deep dive.
If we synthesize all the source material, the core thesis is this. The covenant Lord perfectly sees, hears, and knows the afflictions of his people. He does not learn about their pain. He actively comprehends it.
He's totally aware.
Based entirely on his sovereign grace, independent of any human merit or action, he unilaterally condescends to rescue them and judge their oppressors on his perfect timetable.
It is a staggering reality. God is aware, God initiates, and God completes the rescue. It is all him from start to finish.
Yeah.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over as you go about the rest of your week.
It is a good thing to think about.
We talked about how the sources show that the 400 years of silence in Egypt were not a lapse in divine attention. They were the flawless execution of a preordained timeline set in Genesis 15. If that is true regarding national Israel, consider your own life. Consider the situations you are facing right now, where it feels like the heavens are entirely silent. You are waiting, you are praying, and nothing is changing. How might those current seasons of silence actually be the active, unseen preparation for a deliverance far greater than your immediate earthly expectations?
That is a powerful question.
Remember that jagged white line on the X-ray from the very beginning of our conversation. We are wired to want the immediate diagnosis and the immediate fix. We want the cast put on today. But we are dealing with a God whose sight is infinite, whose knowledge is covenantal, and whose timing operates on a cosmic scale we cannot possibly fathom.
Right.
The silence is not absence. The fire in the bush is still burning, and the God who speaks from it has surely seen your affliction. Thank you for listening. This concludes our deep dive.